It was finally working. After all the trouble it had caused me, it was finally done and I could move forward. Having removed the mechanism from the swing, I needed to replace it, but I didn't want to rebuild it exactly as it was, as the main drive shaft had been overhanging the new framework. I wanted to fit everything within the framework, and if possible, move the turntable away from the facade so I might be able to fill a little more of the gap in. I couldn't move the cradle holding the turntable forward of it, as that would block the connectors at the top of the swing arm, so I'd have to move both the cradle and the turntable back. With that out the way, it should be possible to fill the two biggest holes in the facade. This didn't leave me with much room for the rack and pinion mechanism, which needed to drive both the swing and columns, with clearance for the rotating arm and the lift arms it pushed. I had a plan to run gears along the rack's frame, then a chain up to the column's drive shaft, but at the time I thought a chain would cross the path of the swing. Watching this back, I could have probably connected to one end of the drive shaft instead of the centre. If I wanted to connect to the centre of the drive shaft, the chain would need to be behind the swing and turntable. I didn't think I could bring this any further forward until I realised the connector wasn't pressed onto the axle. With that out of the way, I was able to bring the whole cradle forward and connect a gear to the back side, then run a chain up to where I needed. I was also able to place a few more tiles around the swing's axle, leaving very little exposed. From here I set out a new frame to support the gears and cradle, before finally building the lower half to test how it worked. The first issue was with a gear on the swing colliding with the two arms fixed to the gear rack. This was easily solved by moving the gears further from the turntable. I found there was also a collision occurring with connectors on the framework, but while fixing that, I realised I'd made a mistake in how I was driving the swing. To fit in the rack and pinion, I'd dropped it below the swing's cradle, then used a 36-tooth gear as an idler to bridge the gap to a 20-tooth gear on the swing's axle. This meant the 20-tooth gear would be rotated the smallest amount when the gear rack was centred, causing the swing to rise higher when moving in one direction than it would in the other. Unfortunately, I seem to have fixed this off stream, but I removed the 20-tooth gear and chained together a pair of gears between axles so they rotated in unison. Everything was working nicely now, so I did a little work tweaking and filling in the platform around the pop-up lever and then looked at a blank space to the right of the swing. I kind of skipped over this part, but early on in the project I tried out some ideas for a pop-out spike trap. I'd learned a lot over the months that followed, and now, armed with this knowledge, I felt this could be the perfect location. I wanted the spikes to pop in and out, so a compact stepper motor should be a good choice. With a little trial and error, I found the right combination of gears and arm length to move the spikes as I needed, then began working out where I could attach plates around it for the facade. This was honestly the trickiest part of the build, piecing together plates in a way that wouldn't obstruct movement, whilst also forming a strong base onto which the covering platform could be fixed. The internals of the platform would need to support and guide the spikes, but I was acutely aware that moving parts like to find every edge and corner they can possibly catch on. Sure enough, once I got the cover on, the spikes jammed against 3 internal plates, which I thought I could get away with not extending across the cover. Oh no, what was that noise? Oh. The jam caused the mechanism to try retracting the spikes when they were already retracted, causing that wonderful grinding noise. With the plates spanning the full width, it ran smooth as silk. I thought I'd show you an example of how I ran the checkered pattern down the edges of walls here. Not at all because I'm running low on new content to show you. I feathered the edges of larger plates with either 1x3 or 1x4 plates, opting for longer plates over 1x2s so they were unable to pivot around the single stud connection. After finishing off this section, I focused on the facade around the swing and columns. The area behind the swing was easily covered over, but the swing had excess arm length that I wanted to hide. I had designed an extension to box in and cover this, but upon testing realised I'd forgotten to account for the chain. Rather than creating an awkward notch in the side of the extension, I decided to extend the surrounding area out in line with the next section over. I also pushed back the original cover, though it was at the sacrifice of continuing through the checkered pattern. With the Facade modified and installed, I noticed a couple of things when I ran the swing. Firstly, it wasn't reaching its peak at the left side, and secondly, there was a regular jerking partway through the movement. I traced this to the connectors holding the columns in place, as the gear at the top of the swing arm was just clipping them as it passed. Pushing parts together firmly worked as a temporary solution, but I wanted to swap out the two connectors if possible. I noticed that the worm gear driving the rack and pinion was pulling itself along its axle and separating the supporting connectors. To prevent this from happening, I surrounded the worm gear with frames that there was no chance of it pulling apart. I also strengthened support of the drivetrain for the pop-out spikes. This ran much more smoothly, so I thought now I'd see whether I could change the connectors attaching the columns. I was hoping I could swap the rear connector for a shorter one, without compromising the stability of the column. It was a little wobbly, but it wasn't any less stable than the second column, so I fixed the cover back on and gave it a test run. It definitely wasn't catching anymore, but it still wasn't raising far enough at the left side. After poking and prodding at the framework for a while, somebody suggested it could be down to the weight of Sonic. Removing him did actually appear to fix it, but I've since realised that his weight would affect the swing in both directions. Blissful in my ignorance, I wanted to test out the driver for the rotating log bridge, so I put the supporting structure in place, wrapped a chain around the gears, and attached the first few sections of the log. It actually worked. No issues to report, though it was possibly rotating a little slower than I wanted. To give it just a little extra speed, I swapped out the 16-tooth driver gear for a 24-tooth. That's more like it.